If death ever came for her, Clara Whitmore had always imagined it would arrive quietly, not on a road swallowed by snow and moonless wind. By the time that thought crossed her mind, her boots were already soaked through, her lungs burned like fire, and the dark line of the forest behind her looked far too close, as if the night itself had learned her name and meant to keep it. She did not look back again. She could not. The sound that had sent her fleeing still lived inside her chest, cold and sharp, and every hurried step over the frozen road felt less like escape than borrowed time. Her thin wool cloak snapped against her ankles. Snow clung to her lashes. The world beyond the storm had vanished, leaving only white air, black trees, and the wild pounding of her heart. Then, through the blur, she saw it, a carriage lantern burning gold against the dark like the last mercy God had forgotten to take away. It moved along the road ahead, steady and noble, its wheels cutting through the snow with the heavy confidence of money, power, and destination. Clara did not stop to wonder whose carriage it was. She did not stop to pray. She gathered what little strength remained in her trembling body and ran harder, one hand clutching the side of the carriage just as it began to pass, the other grasping at the door handle with desperate, numbed fingers. The door gave beneath her hand. She stumbled inside, breathless, half falling onto polished flooring and thick, dark rugs that smelled faintly of cedar and winter smoke. The warmth hit her first, then the silence. Clara froze where she had landed. One gloved hand braced against the seat, the other pressed to her chest. She was not alone. Across from her, seated with the stillness of a portrait come to life, was a man. He wore a black overcoat cut with perfect restraint, gloves of fine leather, and the kind of composure only old power could afford. He had one arm resting along the seat beside him, the other near a silver-topped cane he did not seem to need. In the dim amber light of the carriage lantern, his face emerged by degrees. Hard cheekbones, a mouth carved more for silence than kindness, and pale gray eyes that lifted to meet hers with a coolness so complete it seemed untouched by the storm. Clara forgot how to breathe. For one terrible second, she wondered if she had traded one danger for another. The carriage did not slow. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside there was only the soft sway of velvet shadows and the sound of her own ragged breathing. The stranger studied her without speaking, his gaze taking in the snow on her hair, the wet hem of her dress, the fear she could not hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, and unmistakably commanding. "Sit down before you fall." Clara stared at him, her fingers tightening around the edge of the seat. "I am sorry," she whispered, though the words barely formed. "I did not know anyone was inside." One dark brow lifted, almost imperceptibly. Clearly, there was no mockery in it. That made it worse. Or perhaps safer. She could not tell. Shaking, she lowered herself to the far edge of the opposite seat, keeping her spine rigid, as if distance alone might protect her from whatever fate she had just chosen. The man reached toward the small brass lamp between them and turned its flames slightly higher. Light spread through the carriage, and in that crueler clarity Clara saw the signet ring on his hand, the crest embroidered into the carriage lining, the unmistakable mark of a great house. Her stomach turned cold. She knew that crest. Everyone in the county did. The house of Ashford. The man before her was not merely wealthy. He was Adrian Ashford, Duke of Blackthorn, the widower no one approached unless summoned, the man people spoke of in lowered voices, as though grief had crowned him with something darker than rank. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Outside, far behind them, another set of wheels struck the frozen road. Adrian Ashford heard it too. His eyes shifted once toward the window, then back to her face, and something in his expression changed. Not softened, never that, but sharpened. "Who," he asked quietly, "is following you?" Clara lowered her gaze to her clasped hands, but the trembling would not stop. Melted snow slipped from the edge of her sleeve and darkened the fine fabric beneath it. She could feel the Duke watching her with that terrible stillness of his, as if he had long ago learned that silence made frightened. People tell the truth faster than kindness ever could. Outside, the wind struck the carriage in sharp gusts, and beneath it came the faint, uneven rhythm of wheels somewhere behind them. Not close enough to overtake them yet. Close enough to make her throat tighten. "I do not know their names," she said at last, her voice unsteady but clear enough to be heard. Only that they were not meant to find me gone before dawn. Adrian Ashford did not look away. That is not an answer. It is a shadow of one. Clara swallowed. The carriage seemed smaller now, the air warmer and harder to breathe. She had spent so many months learning how to make herself quiet, how to step lightly through rooms where her presence was useful but never wanted, that speaking plainly felt almost indecent. Yet something in his tone left no room for evasion. It was not cruelty. It was authority shaped by long habit, the sort that expected doors to open and truths to rise when summoned. I was employed at Briar Glen House, she said, forcing each word out whole. As a companion to Mrs. Pembroke's sister. I copied letters, read aloud in the evenings, and kept to my place. That was all. A pause followed. The Duke's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened with quiet attention. And tonight, Clara looked toward the dark glass of the carriage window, where her reflection trembled pale and ghost-like against the storm. Tonight, I learned that a woman can hear her future decided in the next room as easily as she hears the weather. Her fingers tightened together until the knuckles whitened. I was not meant to marry. I was not meant for any honor. I was simply convenient. A debt to be settled. A difficulty to be moved where no one would ask questions. The words fell between them and seemed to alter the air itself. Adrian leaned back by a fraction, his jaw set, one gloved hand resting motionless over the silver head of his cane. He did not interrupt. That, more than anything, gave Clara the strength to continue. I was told I should be grateful, she said, and a bitter little breath escaped her. Almost a laugh, and not one at all. That a woman without fortune has no right to be difficult. That comfort is a generous bargain, no matter what it costs. She lifted her eyes then, meeting his directly for the first time since she had recognized him. So I left before I could be handed over like household property. For a long moment, there was only the groan of wood, the rush of winter beyond the carriage walls, and the measured silence of the man across from her. Then Adrian turned his head slightly toward the front and struck the roof once with the end of his cane. The carriage surged faster. Clara caught herself against the seat as the motion changed. You believe they are following to bring you back, he said. Yes. And if they reach my gates? She felt the question like a blade laid flat, cold but not yet cutting. Clara straightened, though fear still moved through her in waves. Then I will leave before they can trouble your household, your grace. Something unreadable passed across his face, there and gone like lantern light beneath water. When he spoke again, his voice was lower than before, quieter, and for that reason more powerful. You entered my carriage in the middle of a storm, Miss Whitmore. Trouble has already chosen my household. Clara's breath caught. Beyond the window, the white darkness thickened, swallowing the road, the trees, and whatever life had existed before this hour. Then, through the veil of falling snow, she saw it at last. Iron gates rising from the storm like the outline of some sleeping kingdom, and beyond them, on a hill of black stone and winter shadow, the first dim lights of Ashford Hall. The gates of Ashford Hall opened without a sound Clara could hear, yet she felt the change as surely as if the world itself had drawn a breath and stepped aside for him. The carriage rolled forward over a long graveled drive glazed with frost, and as they climbed the hill, the house emerged fully from the storm. It was larger than any place Clara had ever entered, built of dark stone that seemed to drink what little moonlight the sky might have offered. Narrow windows glimmered here and there behind the snow, each one holding a candle flame like a secret too old to speak aloud. No music came from within. No warmth seemed to rise from it. Ashford Hall did not look abandoned. It looked preserved, as though grief had sealed it, carefully against time. Clara remained very still as the carriage slowed beneath the front portico. Her pulse had not settled since the moment she had seen the Duke's crest by lantern light. Yet now another feeling moved beneath the fear, quieter and stranger. She had escaped one fate only to arrive at a house where sorrow seemed to have made itself master. Adrian Ashford reached for the carriage door before a footman could open it from outside. Cold air rushed in at once, carrying snow, iron, and the distant sharp scent of pine. He stepped down first, his movements controlled and unhurried, then turned and offered Clara his gloved hand. It was the first gesture of courtesy he had given her, and perhaps because it was so simple, It unsettled her more than his command ever had. She looked at his hand for a moment too long before placing her own in it. His grip was steady, firm enough to guide her safely to the ground, careful enough not to startle. When her boots touched the stone, she nearly faltered from exhaustion, but Adrian's hand remained beneath her elbow just long enough to keep her upright. Then he released her at once, as if he had noticed the tremor that passed through her and wished to spare her embarrassment. The great front doors opened before them. Warmth met her, though not the easy warmth of a cheerful home. It was the warmth of large fires burning in large rooms, duty given shape and flame. A butler stood waiting in the entrance hall, tall and grave, his silver hair precise, his face schooled into such composure that only the faintest lift of his brows betrayed surprise at the sight of Clara beside his master. Behind him, two maids had gone motionless near the staircase, their hands still full of folded linens. Clara felt their eyes at once. Not hostile, not yet, but sharpened by confusion. A drenched young woman arriving after midnight in the Duke's private carriage was not a sight that belonged to ordinary household order. Adrian removed his gloves one finger at a time and handed them to the butler. "Miss Whitmore will remain here tonight," he said. His voice carried through the entrance hall with the ease of long command. "Prepare the blue chamber. Dry clothes. Tea. Food, if the kitchens are not yet closed." The butler inclined his head. "At once, Your Grace." Nothing more was asked. Clara watched that with a kind of awe. At Briar Glen, every irregularity had invited whispers before the door even closed. Here, a single sentence from Adrian Ashford arranged the night itself. Still, she could feel the silence that followed his order. It moved through the hall like an unseen draft, disturbing everything it touched. One of the maids lowered her gaze quickly. The other glanced toward the portrait above the far mantel before looking away again. Clara followed that glance without meaning to. The painting was large, framed in gold darkened by age, and even in the dim light, she could see the woman within it. She wore pale silk. One hand rested on the back of a carved chair. Her face was lovely in the distant, formal way of portraits, but it was her expression that held Clara still. It was not smiling, not sad, simply calm in the manner of those who have always expected a room to belong to them. The late Duchess, Clara thought at once. The woman whose absence had not lessened with time, only hardened into architecture. She turned back too late and found Adrian watching her. There was no anger in his face, only a reserve so complete it seemed older than the house itself. "Mrs. Doyle will see to you," he said. An older woman in black stepped forward from a side corridor, her keys quiet at her waist, her expression proper and unreadable. "Come with me, miss." Clara should have thanked him. She knew that. She opened her mouth, but before the words could form, a hard knock sounded at the outer door. Not loud, not violent, yet every person in the hall seemed to feel it. Adrian did not turn immediately. His gaze stayed on Clara for one long, measured second, and when he finally looked toward the door, something cold settled over his features like a mask returning to its rightful place. "No one opens it," he said. The second knock came a few moments later, no louder than the first, yet it carried farther through the entrance hall, as though the winter night itself had learned patience and meant to test the walls stone by stone. No one moved. The maid stood frozen with lowered eyes. The butler held his hands neatly before him, though Clara noticed the tightening at his jaw. Mrs. Doyle, still waiting beside her, kept her face composed in the manner of a woman who had served long enough to know that fear must never be allowed to look useful. Only Adrian Ashford seemed entirely untouched by the sound. He stood beneath the dim light of the hall with one hand resting lightly on the head of his cane, his posture unaltered, his expression calm in that severe and distant way that made calm itself seem dangerous. Clara realized then that the true force of power was not loudness. It was the ability to remain still while everyone else waited to see what you would permit the world to do next. The Duke glanced once toward the butler. "Have the side lamps extinguished," he said, "and send 2 men to the south windows." Quietly, "Yes, Your Grace." The butler departed at once, his shoes making almost no sound over the polished floor. Adrian turned his attention to Clara again, and under that pale, level gaze she felt the full disorder of herself. Damp hair coming loose from its pins, gloves worn thin at the fingertips, boots marked with road salt, a heart still pounding too fast beneath borrowed safety. "Did anyone see where you ran?" he asked. Clara searched her memory through the blur of panic and snow. "I do not know. I left through the service door near the kitchens. The yard was dark. I heard voices after I crossed the lower gate, but I never turned to see who followed." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in calculation. "Then they are searching by instinct, not certainty. That favors us." Us. The word settled over Clara with strange weight. She had not belonged to an us in a very long time. At Briar Glen House, she had existed in the margin of other people's comfort, necessary only while she remained agreeable. Here, in the entrance hall of a house she had never imagined entering, a duke she did not know had folded her fate into his with a single syllable. It should not have comforted her. Yet it did. Mrs. Doyle stepped closer, her voice respectful but low. "Your Grace, the young lady is shaking from the cold." Adrian gave the smallest nod, as though returning from some inward distance. "Take her upstairs." Clara found herself speaking before caution could. "Stop her, Your Grace." He paused. It was the first time she had addressed him with intent rather than fear. "I do not wish to bring scandal to your door." The words came softly, but once begun they would not be recalled. "If those men are only searching on suspicion, then perhaps it would be better if I were sent out by another way before morning. I could go anywhere. To the village. To the church house. I would not ask to remain." Nothing changed in his face at first. That, she would come to learn, was often when he was most deeply displeased. He looked at her as though he were weighing not the request itself, but the condition of the soul that had made it. "Miss Whitmore," he said at last, and his voice was very quiet, which made every word land with greater force. "The storm is dropping nearly an inch an hour. The roads below the ridge are already icing over. The nearest village is more than 4 miles away, and the church house roof was damaged last month." Clara blinked. She had not expected him to know such details. "You are not leaving this house tonight." The statement was not harsh. It was final. Before she could answer, the butler returned from the darkened corridor. "The lamps are out, Your Grace. 2 riders are near the gate. They have not entered the drive." Adrian inclined his head once. "Good. Let them wonder." Then, with no further attention given to the matter, as if uncertainty at his gates were less pressing than the condition of one exhausted stranger, he crossed to the small table beneath the portrait and lifted a candlestick himself. The flame gilded one side of his face, leaving the scar of grief that lived in his silence even more visible for not being named. He handed the light to Mrs. Doyle. "The blue chamber," he repeated, "and send for Dr. Mercer in the morning. I want her seen before noon." Clara stared at him. "I do not require a doctor." One corner of his mouth moved, though it was not quite a smile. That was not a question. Mrs. Doyle gestured gently toward the staircase, and this time Clara obeyed. She mounted the first few steps with stiff, tired legs, then looked back without meaning to. Adrian had not moved from where he stood. Below the great portrait, framed by shadow and candlelight, he seemed less like a man than part of the house itself, carved into its silence, bound to its winter, impossible to read. But as Clara turned away, she saw him glance toward the locked front door, and in his eyes, for the briefest instant, there was something colder than anger and far more protective than courtesy. The blue chamber was warmer than any room Clara had slept in for years, yet for several moments after Mrs. Doyle closed the door, she remained standing just inside it, unable to trust the quiet. The fire had already been laid and lit. A kettle steamed softly on the small grate. Candlelight rested over everything with a restrained and careful glow, touching polished wood, pale wallpaper, and a bed so wide and white it seemed meant for some gentler version of the world than the one she had known. A folded nightdress lay waiting on a chair beside the hearth, along with a thick wool robe and a pair of house slippers lined with fur. On the round table near the window, someone had set a tray of tea, broth, bread, and cold sliced apples, as if her arrival had been expected by the house long before she had ever heard its name. Clara lifted a hand to the back of the chair to steady herself. She had been cold for so many hours that warmth felt almost painful, as though it were not entering her skin, but waking every place in her that winter and fear had numbed. Mrs. Doyle moved with competent silence, pouring tea into a porcelain cup the color of cream. "Drink this first," she said. "Food after." Clara obeyed. the cup trembling faintly between her fingers. The tea was strong and plain, with a little honey stirred in, and the first swallow nearly undid her. She looked down quickly, ashamed of the tears that rose without warning. Mrs. Doyle noticed, but if she judged, she hid it well. "You are safe for the night," she said, not kindly exactly, but not unkindly either. It was the sort of statement made by women who had outlived softness and learned the greater value of usefulness. Clara took another sip. "Does everyone in this house obey him so quickly?" Mrs. Doyle adjusted the fold of the robe on the chair. "Everyone in this house knows when His Grace has already decided a thing." The answer should have ended there, yet something in the older woman's expression shifted, as if memory had brushed past her. "He has not brought a guest here at this hour before." Clara lowered her eyes to the tea. The room suddenly felt too elegant for her presence. She saw again the portrait in the entrance hall, the calm face of the late Duchess watching from a frame darkened by candle smoke and years. "I did not mean to enter his life," she said quietly. "I only entered his carriage." Mrs. Doyle gave the faintest sound, not quite amusement and not quite sympathy. In some houses, those become the same thing. Clara did not know how to answer that. When Mrs. Doyle left her at last, promising to return for the tray later, the room fell into a silence so complete that even the fire seemed to burn with restraint. Clara changed slowly into the nightdress and robe, her fingers clumsy with fatigue. Her own clothes, now drying on a screen near the hearth, looked smaller somehow, poorer than they had that morning, as if Ashford Hall had a way of revealing the thinness of all things brought into it. She ate a little broth, then half a slice of bread, but weariness pressed against her eyes and turned every thought heavy. Still, when she moved toward the bed, she stopped by the window instead. Snow streamed across the dark grounds in silver sheets. Beyond the reach of the nearest lamp, the world vanished into storm. She should have felt relief. No rider could easily cross that white emptiness now. No one could come for her before dawn. Yet safety in a strange house has its own loneliness. She rested her fingertips against the cold glass and looked down toward the front drive. At first she saw nothing but the blur of snow. Then, far below, a lantern moved once near the gate and disappeared. Clara's breath caught. Someone was still there, watching, waiting. A sudden knock at her chamber door made her start so sharply that the window pane shivered beneath her hand. Before she could speak, the latch turned and Mrs. Doyle entered again, this time with a face more guarded than before. "His Grace asks that your door be locked from the inside tonight," she said. Clara stared at her. "Why?" Mrs. Doyle hesitated only a fraction, but Clara saw it. "Because one of the riders at the gate has sent in a message." The room seemed to grow still around those words. Clara's pulse began to beat hard once more, drowning out even the storm. "What message?" Mrs. Doyle looked toward the fire, then back at her. "Only this," she said. "They claim you do not belong here. And they insist the Duke has taken in what is already promised to another man." Clara did not realize she had stepped backward until the edge of the bed touched the backs of her knees. For one suspended moment, she simply stood there in the soft blue chamber, the fire low beside her, the storm pressing at the windows, and the words of the message hanging in the air like something colder than snow. Promised to another man. It was a phrase dressed in respectability, and for that reason it felt uglier than any insult. Mrs. Doyle closed the door firmly behind her and crossed the room with measured steps, as though she feared that too much haste might turn fear into panic. "Lock it after I leave," she said. "Do not answer if anyone knocks unless you hear my voice or His Grace's." Clara stared at her. Would they truly dare to enter this house? Mrs. Doyle did not answer at once, and the silence itself was answer enough. Ashford Hall was powerful, yes, but power did not prevent ambition from making foolish men bold. Clara drew the robe more tightly around herself. Her fingers had gone cold again, though the room was warm. "I told him I should have left before dawn," she whispered, more to herself than to Mrs. Doyle. "I have brought trouble exactly as I feared." The older woman's face remained composed, but something in her gaze sharpened. "No, miss. Trouble was already following you. His Grace merely chose not to step aside and let it pass over you." Clara lowered her eyes. She did not know what to do with that kind of mercy. It asked nothing, and yet seemed to place her under a debt she could never repay. At Briar Glen House, every favor had carried its price openly or in silence. Here, The Duke had given shelter as if it were the simplest thing in the world, and that simplicity unsettled her more than coercion would have. Mrs. Doyle moved to the hearth and adjusted the kettle with practical hands. The message did not come from the man himself, she said. Only from one of his servants. That matters. Clara looked up. Why? Because men who truly believe they possess a thing do not send servants to ask for it back. They come claiming certainty. Clara considered that. The thought did not comfort her, but it steadied her. Somewhere beyond the gates, in the white darkness below the ridge, sat men who had expected her to be frightened enough to surrender. They were still waiting because they had not yet found a way to be sure of their power. That, at least, was something. What will His Grace do? She asked quietly. Mrs. Doyle set the kettle back in place and straightened. What He always does. He will decide which truths matter and then make the rest of the world endure them. The answer held no romance, no admiration meant to soothe. It was merely fact. Clara moved slowly to the chair by the fire and sat, the robe pooling around her ankles, her damp hair loose over one shoulder. She felt very young then, though hardship had made her older in all the invisible ways. Does He often defend strangers? She asked. Mrs. Doyle's expression altered by the smallest degree. No. That single word settled over the room with peculiar force. Clara looked down at the faint steam rising from the untouched tea. She remembered the Duke standing in the entrance hall beneath the portrait of his dead wife, candlelight along one side of his face, winter on the other, telling an entire household that she would remain. He had not hesitated. He had not even seemed surprised by his own decision. And that troubled her because it suggested not impulse, but instinct. As if somewhere beneath his discipline and reserve there remained a part of him that still moved first toward protection. Mrs. Doyle walked to the door and rested her hand on the brass latch. Try to sleep, she said. Morning always changes the shape of a night's fear. Clara almost smiled at that, though faintly. Does it? Mrs. Doyle considered her for a moment. Not always. But it often gives pride enough daylight to retreat. Then she left, and the door closed softly behind her. Clara turned the key at once. The click sounded too small for what it was meant to protect. For a long while she remained by the fire, watching the flames shift through the grate, listening to the muffled life of the house. Somewhere below, a door opened and shut. Footsteps crossed a corridor. Wind brushed the stone with a hollow sound like distant breath. At last, when weariness outweighed fear, she stood and moved toward the bed. But before she reached it, something caught her eye near the writing desk by the window. A folded sheet of paper had been tucked beneath the edge of the inkstand, half hidden by shadow. Clara frowned. She was certain it had not been there earlier. Slowly she crossed the room and lifted it. No seal. No name. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the single page. There were only 7 words written in a sharp, hurried hand. He could not protect his first wife either. For several seconds Clara could only stare at the words, her fingers tightening around the page until the paper bent at the edges. The fire crackled softly behind her. The room remained warm, and yet a deep chill moved through her all the same, as if whoever had written the note had found a way to open a window inside her thoughts. He could not protect his first wife either. She read it again, then a third time, each repetition sharpening the cruelty of it. This was not warning alone. It was knowledge. Intimate knowledge, wielded like a blade concealed in velvet. Someone within the house had placed it here. Someone had entered while she was absent or found means to leave it unseen. That realization unsettled her more than the message from the gate ever had. Danger beyond the walls could be shut out for a night. Danger already breathing the same air as you was another matter entirely. Clara crossed quickly to the door and checked the lock, though she knew she had turned it herself. Then she stood listening, her pulse beating too loudly in her ears. Nothing. No footsteps. No whisper beneath the threshold. Only the faint groan of winter against old stone and the distant hush of a sleeping house that did not feel asleep at all. Slowly she looked back at the note. The handwriting was sharp, hurried, and unfamiliar to her, but one thing was clear. Whoever wrote it wanted her afraid of Adrian Ashford, not merely afraid for herself. That thought forced her to pause. Since entering his carriage, the Duke had given her no false promise, no charm, no easy gentleness meant to win trust cheaply. He had questioned her, sheltered her, commanded where command was needed, and left dignity standing wherever he could. Even his silence had not felt cruel. Yet this note reached unerringly for the one wound in the house that all others seemed to circle in silence. The dead Duchess whose portrait watched from below, whose absence had settled into every corridor like winter dust. Clara folded the page with careful hands. She could not decide whether to burn it at once or hide it until morning. Burn it, and she would lose proof. Keep it, and she would spend the night with its poison too near. In the end, she slipped it into the pocket of her robe, pressed close against her side, and moved toward the bed, though she had no hope of sleep now. She had just reached the coverlet when a sound came from somewhere beyond the wall to her left. Not loud, not alarming in itself. The subtle scrape of wood, as if a door had been opened with caution and then shut again. Clara stood still. Mrs. Doyle had said the blue chamber was prepared for guests, which meant there were likely neighboring rooms. Yet in a house like this, at such an hour, every small sound seemed full of meaning. She extinguished one of the candles, then another, until only the fire remained and the chamber fell into a softer half-dark. The room changed at once. Shadows lengthened across the wallpaper. The mirror above the mantel reflected only fragments of the bed and the pale blur of her robe. Clara moved to the hearth and stood with her hand on the mantel, listening. Again came the faintest noise, this time followed by a low murmur of voices beyond the wall or perhaps down the corridor. One voice was too distant to distinguish. The other, though softened by stone and space, carried a measured tone she recognized at once. Adrian. She could not hear the words, only the shape of them, clipped, controlled, without waste. Then silence. A minute later footsteps passed outside her door, firm and unhurried. They did not pause. They continued down the hall and faded. Clara let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She should not have been relieved merely because she recognized his step. Yet she was. That frightened her in a new way. Trust, she had learned, often arrived disguised as gratitude and did not reveal its danger until too late. Still, the note in her pocket and the memory of his voice beyond the wall drew her in opposite directions. Someone wanted her to believe the Duke's protection was an illusion. Someone else, perhaps the Duke himself, was awake in the depth of night guarding a house that had become more unsettled since her arrival. At last Clara climbed into the bed, though sleep did not come. Hours seemed to pass in a drifting haze of firelight and listening. Toward dawn the storm began to quiet, and with that quiet came the first true stillness of the night. It must have been near morning when exhaustion finally pulled her under. But rest did not last long. A sharp knock sounded at her chamber door, followed almost at once by Mrs. Doyle's voice, low and controlled, but lacking its usual calm. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "you must wake at once. His Grace wants you downstairs. Something has happened in the West Gallery." Clara was out of bed before the last word had fully reached her. The blue chamber, so guarded and unreal in candlelight, seemed different now in the thin gray hour before sunrise, when every shadow looked stripped of mystery and left only with truth. She pulled on the robe, slipped her feet into the lined slippers, and unlocked the door with fingers that still felt clumsy from interrupted sleep. Mrs. Doyle stood in the corridor holding a candle whose flame shook slightly as they began to walk, though whether from the draft or from the woman's restraint Clara could not tell. The hall was colder than it had been in the night. Dawn had not yet fully entered the windows, and Ashford Hall seemed suspended between dark and light, as if the house itself had not decided which world it belonged to. "What happened?" Clara asked in a low voice. Mrs. Doyle kept her gaze ahead. Something was left in the West Gallery. Clara's hand tightened at her side, instinctively seeking the hidden note still tucked into the pocket of her robe. Another message? Worse, Mrs. Doyle said quietly. They descended the staircase and crossed a long corridor lined with family portraits dim in the morning half-light. The West Gallery opened at the end of it, a narrow, elegant room filled with tall windows overlooking the snow-covered grounds. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside white and silent, the lawn smoothed into a deceptive peace beneath the paling sky. Inside the gallery, that peace had been broken. 2 footmen stood near the far wall, rigid and pale. The butler was there as well, along with a housemaid whose eyes were red, though whether from fear or embarrassment Clara did not know. Adrian Ashford stood beside the central window, one hand resting on the back of a chair, his other glove though he had clearly dressed in haste. He wore black again, severe as winter, his expression composed in that dangerous way she had already come to recognize. When Clara entered, his eyes lifted to her at once. "Come here," he said. She obeyed without thinking. That unsettled her almost as much as what awaited. On the polished floor beneath the window lay a broken picture frame. The glass had cracked, though not shattered completely, and the portrait inside had slipped partly free. Clara knew the face before she fully saw it. The late Duchess. The same calm beauty from the hall below, now lying crooked within splintered gilt. But it was not the damage to the frame that made the room feel so still. Across the portrait, written in dark ink in a hand swift and merciless, were 4 words. She was not the first. Clara stopped where she was, the blood draining from her face. The message struck with deliberate cruelty, not merely at memory, but at pattern, at warning, at the terrible suggestion that the house had witnessed this kind of fear before and failed it before. She became aware, all at once, of Adrian's attention fixed on her, not to study her weakness but to gauge its cost. "This was found at first light," he said. His voice was low enough that the servants could pretend not to hear. "No one in this room saw who placed it." Clara forced herself to look away from the portrait and up at him. "It is meant for me." "Yes," he said. No softness. No denial. Only truth. That honesty steadied her more than comfort could have. She slipped the folded note from her pocket and held it out. Then this was as well. Adrian took it, read it once, and something in his face changed so slightly that another person might have missed it. But Clara saw it. Not shock. Recognition. A cold, inward certainty, as if 2 scattered pieces of a pattern had finally met in his hand. He folded the page again with terrible care. "You should have shown this to me at once." Clara lowered her eyes. "I did not know whom to trust." Silence followed. Not offended silence. Wounded silence. When she looked up, his gaze had shifted from the note to her face, and for the first time since she had entered his carriage, the reserve in him seemed less like distance than restraint held under strain. "A sensible answer," he said at last. Then he turned to the butler. "No one leaves the house without my permission. No letters are sent. No visitors received." The room drew breath around his authority. But when his eyes returned to Clara, the command in them altered into something quieter and far more dangerous to her composure. "And from this moment on," he said, "you do not walk anywhere in this house alone." The order altered the room more completely than any raised voice could have done. No one argued. No one even looked surprised. The butler inclined his head at once. The footmen stepped back as if the floor itself had instructed them, and the housemaid lowered her reddened eyes to the broken portrait on the floor. Clara remained where she was, the pale morning light from the tall windows spilling across the polished boards between her and the Duke. "You do not walk anywhere in this house alone." The words should have felt like restriction. Instead, they landed somewhere far more dangerous, in the silent and wounded place inside her that had gone too long without protection to know what to do with it when it finally arrived. Adrian bent and lifted the damaged portrait himself. He did not call a servant to handle it. He took it from the floor with a care so controlled it seemed almost reverent, though his face revealed nothing beyond that familiar composure sharpened by anger held in check. Ink still marred the painted silk of his late wife's gown. One gloved thumb rested for the briefest moment against the ruined edge of the frame before he handed it to the butler. "Have this cleaned if it can be," he said. "If it cannot, it is to be removed from sight until I decide otherwise." "Yes, Your Grace." The butler received it as one might receive something both fragile and sacred. Adrian then turned toward the nearest maid. "Who had care of this gallery last evening?" The young woman swallowed. "Martha and I dusted here before supper, Your Grace." The portrait was undisturbed then. "And after supper?" "No one was assigned here, sir." Clara watched him listen. He did not press with cruelty. He did not threaten. Yet every question stripped the room closer to truth simply because he expected truth to answer him. It was the same force she had felt inside the carriage and again in the entrance hall. Authority in him was not performance. It was bone deep, grave and cold and absolute. He dismissed the servants with a quiet word, keeping only the butler in the doorway. When they were alone enough for privacy, he looked once more at the note Clara had given him. The morning light showed the hard line of his mouth and the fatigue that had settled beneath his eyes. Perhaps he had not slept at all. These messages were written by someone who knows the history of this house, he said, and who intends to use that history against you. Clara folded her hands tightly before her. Against me, or against you? His gaze lifted to hers. At present, there is no useful difference. The answer startled her by its plainness. She had expected distance, perhaps denial, some formal reminder that she was only an accidental guest. Instead, he spoke as though the attack on her safety had already become an attack on his order, his household, his dead, and whatever remained of his peace. Clara turned toward the frost-veiled windows, beyond which the grounds lay white and deceptively calm. If the person behind this is inside the house, then I have brought danger beneath your own roof. No, Adrian said. The word was quiet, but it stopped her at once. You revealed it. She looked back at him. He had moved no closer, yet the room felt smaller suddenly, bound by the force of his certainty. Cowardice thrives in silence, Miss Whitmore. Last night, whoever did this expected you to be isolated, ashamed, and easily frightened away. This morning they wished to test whether I could be provoked into retreat. His expression grew colder, not cruel but sharpened by purpose. They will be disappointed. Clara lowered her gaze because something in her chest had tightened too quickly. Gratitude, fear, disbelief, all woven together. No one had ever spoken of her safety as if it were a matter worth defending on principle. Before she could answer, the butler stepped forward from the doorway. Dr. Mercer has arrived, Your Grace. And there is another matter. Adrian glanced toward him. What matter? The butler hesitated, which in a man so self-contained was startling in itself. The lock on the west gallery window was found unfastened from the inside. Silence followed. Not empty silence. The kind that gathers before an idea becomes dangerous. Clara felt the blood leave her face. The snow outside, the riders at the gate, the notes slipped into private rooms, the ruined portrait, all of it had suggested malice. But this was something colder. Access. Deliberate access. Adrian said nothing for a moment. He only turned and looked at the window in question, at the faint mark where frost had been disturbed near the latch. Then his eyes returned to Clara, and what she saw there changed the shape of the morning entirely. He no longer looked merely watchful. He looked resolved. Mrs. Doyle will move you to the east rooms after breakfast, he said. The chamber beside the old library. It has only one entrance, and the key remains with me. Clara stared at him. Your Grace, that is not necessary. It is. His voice dropped lower, and for the first time since dawn there was something beneath the command that was not iron but feeling, restrained so tightly it became more powerful for its restraint. Someone entered this house in the night, or someone within it opened the way. Until I know which, I am not trusting distance, locked doors, or chance. He stepped closer then, only a pace, but enough that she could see the pale gray of his eyes clearly in the winter light. You are under my protection now, Clara. It was the first time he had spoken her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, low and certain and utterly without ornament, struck her harder than the order itself. Then the butler, still standing near the door, cleared his throat with unusual care. Your Grace, he said quietly, Dr. Mercer is not alone. The gentleman from Briar Glen House has come with him. He claims he is Miss Whitmore's intended husband. The words struck Clara with such force that for a moment the gallery, the windows, even the pale sweep of morning beyond the glass seemed to fall away. Intended husband. The phrase was grotesque in its neatness, a ribbon tied over something ugly and coercive. Her breath caught, and Adrian saw it at once. She knew he saw it because the stillness in him changed. It did not break. It sharpened. The butler, perhaps recognizing that he had delivered enough disturbance for one room, lowered his gaze and added with careful restraint, He asks to be received at once, Your Grace. Dr. Mercer is waiting in the morning room. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Clara, and in that held silence she felt the terrible relief of being observed by someone who missed nothing. Is this man the one you fled from? He asked. There was no gentleness in the question, but there was something steadier than gentleness. Respect. He would not decide the truth for her. He would hear it from her mouth. Clara forced air into her lungs. No, she said. Not exactly. He is the man they intended me for. Mr. Nathaniel Pembroke. He is Mrs. Pembroke's nephew. Adrian's expression did not alter, though the cold in it deepened. Did you ever consent to such an arrangement? No. The answer came quickly now, clearer than any she had yet given. It was discussed around me, over me, behind closed doors, and then in front of me as though my silence were a signature. Her hands had begun to tremble again, so she clasped them tightly. He was told I would come to understand my good fortune. Adrian looked at her for one long moment, and something in his face became so still, it was almost severe. You will not be presented to him unless you choose it. Clara stared. The certainty of it moved through her like warmth after cold, so deep it hurts. Before she could speak, Adrian turned to the butler. Dr. Mercer may remain. Mr. Pembroke will wait. Yes, Your Grace. In the west sitting room. Not the morning room. The distinction seemed small, but Clara understood instinctively that it was not. The morning room suggested welcome, daylight, civility. Waiting in the west sitting room was something else entirely. The butler bowed and withdrew. When the door closed, the gallery felt larger and quieter than before. Clara looked toward the ruined portrait now gone from the floor, leaving only a faint scatter of glass that caught the weak light. He will not leave easily, she said. Adrian moved to the window where the latch had been disturbed and rested his gloved fingers on the sill. That is unfortunate for him. She might have thought the words arrogant if not for the perfect calm with which he spoke them. There was no vanity in Adrian Ashford, only authority, old and disciplined and cold enough to make resistance seem tiresome. Clara lowered her gaze. You should not involve yourself further, Your Grace. If he returns to Briar Glen House insulted, they will talk. They will say I compromised your household. They will say worse of me. Adrian turned back to her. They already intend to say worse. She looked up. He had come nearer without her noticing, close enough that his voice no longer needed to carry. Scandal is a cheap weapon, Miss Whitmore. It is usually chosen by those who lack better ones. The words should not have comforted her. Yet they did. He studied her face, and his own expression altered by the smallest degree, as if some hidden judgment had been reached. You are pale, he said. Sit before Dr. Mercer arrives, or I will have to answer for your collapse in addition to my other inconveniences. It was the driest thing he had said to her, and because it was so restrained, so unexpectedly human, Clara nearly smiled. Nearly. Instead she obeyed, lowering herself onto the chair nearest the window. Adrian remained standing beside her, not looming, not softening, simply present with that grave steadiness that made the air around him feel ordered. After a moment Clara said, more quietly than before, Why are you doing this? He did not pretend not to understand. His gaze shifted briefly to the white grounds beyond the glass, then back to her. Because someone brought fear into my house and expected me to mistake it for authority. His voice lowered further. And because you looked at that door last night as though the world had never once opened without asking a price. Clara could not speak. The truth of it was too clean. A knock sounded at the gallery entrance. This time it was gentle. Dr. Mercer entered, carrying his black bag, his kind face lined with concern and cold. But before he could approach, another sound drifted faintly from farther down the corridor, a man's raised voice, indignant even through the walls, insisting he had every right to see the lady at once. Adrian did not even turn toward it. His eyes stayed on Clara. Now, he said quietly, you will see what kind of man believes a woman can be claimed like property, and he will learn what happens when he comes to my house expecting obedience. Dr. Mercer, whether by instinct or long practice, understood at once that he had entered a room where medicine was not the only matter at hand. He gave Clara a brief, courteous bow, then paused a respectful distance away, his lined face kind but observant beneath silver brows. Miss Whitmore, he said, His Grace thought it wise that I see whether the cold has done you any lasting harm. Clara managed a faint nod. Thank you, Doctor. Adrian remained beside the window, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. He had not placed it there possessively, nor even protectively in any visible sense, yet the gesture altered the room all the same. It made clear, to doctor and servant alike, that Clara did not stand alone in Ashford Hall, whatever rumor or claim might be pressing at its doors. Dr. Mercer set down his black bag and began with simple questions, his voice gentle enough that Clara found herself answering more easily than she had expected. Had she struck her head while fleeing? No. Was she in pain? Only tired. Had she eaten? Some broth. Tea. Bread. At that the doctor nodded with quiet approval, and took her wrist to count her pulse. His fingers were cool, professional, and unhurried. Exhaustion, he said after a moment. Fright, cold, and lack of proper rest. Nothing more serious that I can find this morning, if she is kept warm and free from further distress. At those last words, a faint and almost humorless look touched Adrian's face, gone so quickly Clara might have imagined it. That is proving difficult, he said. Dr. Mercer glanced between them, and though he was too discreet to ask directly, Clara sensed he understood more than he intended to say. Then perhaps less conversation and more breakfast would be wise, he replied. And if there is household unrest, the young lady should be spared it where possible. She will be, Adrian said. The certainty of it was such that even Dr. Mercer, who had likely known him many years, gave only a brief incline of the head and no further advice. Yet before he could gather his instruments, the raised voice from the corridor came again, louder now, stripped of courtesy by impatience. Clara felt the sound before she fully understood the words. Nathaniel Pembroke. She had heard him in drawing rooms, at supper, in the library doorway when he chose to linger too near and speak as if the future were already his to assign. But never had his voice carried such frustration. I have come a considerable distance through ice and snow, he snapped somewhere beyond the gallery. You will not keep me waiting like a tradesman. Adrian did not move. Neither did Clara. Yet the room changed. Whatever fragile calm Dr. Mercer had created with his measured questions vanished, and in its place came that sharpened stillness she had already learned to associate with the Duke's displeasure. He looked down at her then, not coldly but with a focus so absolute it made the rest of the house seem distant. You are not obliged to see him, he said. Clara swallowed. The doctor busied himself quietly with his bag, pretending not to hear. If I do not, she said, he will turn insult into outrage. He will tell them I hid because I am ashamed. Adrian's gaze did not leave her face. And are you? The question was so direct that it cut through every practiced fear. Clara sat a little straighter in the chair. No, then let him spend his outrage alone. She had not meant to look at him the way she did then, with something too close to wonder and too raw to disguise. But Adrian Ashford had the unnerving habit of saying the precise thing no one else in her life had ever considered saying. Not what would soothe a frightened woman. What would? Restore her to herself. Before she could answer, the butler appeared at the threshold, grave as ever, though a faint color had risen high in his cheeks. Your Grace, he said, Mr. Pembroke insists that if he is not received now, he will address the matter before the magistrate. Dr. Mercer went very still. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. In a smaller household, such a threat might have caused commotion. In Ashford Hall, it produced only silence. Adrian turned his head slightly toward the doorway. Will he said. The softness of his tone was more dangerous than anger. The butler, who clearly knew this, lowered his eyes. Those were his words, sir. Adrian considered the matter for one heartbeat, then another. At last he reached for the black gloves he had removed earlier and drew them on with slow, precise movements, one finger at a time. The gesture held no haste and no uncertainty. Clara realized, with a sudden quickening in her chest, that this was how other people must feel just before a storm breaks over open ground. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Very well, Adrian said. I will receive Mr. Pembroke. Clara's breath caught, but before dread could settle, he looked at her once more. You will remain here until I send for you. Your Grace, she began, but he was already shaking his head. No, it was not refusal born of authority alone. It was refusal born of intention. He does not gain the right to stand before you simply because he has learned to raise his voice. That might have been the end of it, but Adrian's eyes lingered on hers for one strange, suspended moment, and what passed through them then was quieter than protection and far more unsettling. Not possession, not pity, only the unspoken promise that he would walk into the next room carrying not only his name and rank, but her dignity as well, and he would not set it down. Then he turned and strode from the gallery with the doctor and butler behind him, leaving Clara alone in the pale morning light, listening to his footsteps recede toward the west sitting room where the man who had thought to claim her was waiting to discover what kind of silence a duke could command. Clara remained in the west gallery long after the last echo of Adrian's footsteps had faded into the deeper corridors of the house. The pale morning had fully entered the windows now, turning the frost on the glass to silver lace and laying a cold, honest light over everything that candlelight had softened. She stood at last and moved toward the nearest window, though she did not truly see the snow-covered lawns below. Her thoughts had already gone elsewhere, down the passage to the west sitting room where Nathaniel Pembroke waited with his grievance polished into entitlement, and Adrian Ashford had gone to meet him without once asking whether the matter was worth his trouble. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Men like Nathaniel involved themselves only when gain was near. Men like Adrian, she was beginning to understand, involved themselves when principle had been crossed, and that was a far rarer thing. Dr. Mercer had taken his leave with a final instruction that she eat, rest, and keep warm, but even his kindly concern had felt secondary once the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere below, a door opened. Then voices, too distant to make out clearly. Clara pressed her fingertips together to stop their trembling. She knew Nathaniel's manner well enough to imagine it. Indignant, polished, self-assured, the tone of a man convinced the world would support him merely because it had done so before. She could also imagine Adrian's stillness in answer, and somehow that image steadied her more than prayer might have done. Minutes passed, or perhaps half an hour. In an anxious house, time ceased to move properly. At last the gallery door opened, and Mrs. Doyle entered carrying a breakfast tray that steamed faintly in the cold light. Her face remained composed, but there was a brightness in her eyes Clara had not seen before, as if some private expectation had just been satisfied. "You are to eat," she said. His Grace was very clear on that point. Clara managed a faint breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "And the other matter?" Mrs. Doyle set the tray down on a small table by the window. Coffee, toast, eggs, a dish of preserves, and a folded napkin arranged with severe care. "The other matter is no longer at liberty to raise his voice in this house." Clara stared. "What does that mean?" Mrs. Doyle hesitated, though only slightly. "It means Mr. Pembroke was informed that he possessed no lawful claim over you, no invitation to this house, and no standing from which to threaten its master." Clara could almost hear the words in Adrian's voice, low and exact and impossible to dispute. "Did he leave?" Mrs. Doyle adjusted the silverware on the tray, though it needed no adjustment at all. "Eventually." There was meaning in that single word, enough that Clara's pulse quickened again. "And his Grace?" "In the library." The older woman's gaze lifted to Clara's face. "He asked that once you have eaten, you should come there." Clara looked down at the untouched breakfast. "Alone? With me beside you until the door." The answer should have comforted her. Instead, a strange nervousness took hold, more difficult than fear because it lacked the clarity of fear. She had expected relief once Nathaniel was sent away. She had not expected this awareness of Adrian Ashford waiting somewhere within the house, wanting to speak to her not as an obligation but as a decision. Mrs. Doyle seemed to notice the shift in her expression, for her voice gentled by a degree. "You need not be afraid of him, miss." Clara lifted her eyes. "I am not." The truth of it surprised her even as she spoke. Mrs. Doyle studied her for a moment, then gave the smallest nod, as though some private observation had just been confirmed. "No," she said quietly. "I do not believe you are." Clara forced herself to eat, though only enough to satisfy the command implied in the tray. The food restored a little strength to her hands and brought a little color back into the cold hollows of her thoughts. When she had finished, Mrs. Doyle led her through corridors now brighter with day, yet no less solemn for it. Ashford Hall in daylight did not lose its melancholy. It merely revealed its discipline. Portraits lined the walls in heavy frames. Carpets softened the echo of footsteps. Tall windows admitted winter light, without ever making the house seem warm. At last they stopped before a double door of dark wood carved with ivy and thorns. The library. Mrs. Doyle laid a hand lightly against Clara's sleeve. "He has been in there since Mr. Pembroke left," she said, "and no one has disturbed him." Clara felt her heart begin to beat too quickly again. "Why tell me that?" Mrs. Doyle's expression turned unreadable once more. "Because when a man who values silence chooses not to keep it, the words that follow are rarely trivial." Then she opened the door. The library beyond was vast and dim, lined from floor to ceiling with books and shadowed by tall shelves that turned the morning light into bands of gold and gray. At the far end, near the great hearth, Adrian Ashford stood with one hand on the mantel and a sealed packet of papers in the other. He looked up as Clara entered, and whatever she had prepared herself to meet vanished at once. There was no anger in his face now, no cold fury, only exhaustion, resolve, and something quieter that reached her before he spoke. Mrs. Doyle withdrew and shut the door behind her. Clara and the Duke were left alone among the books, the fire, and the winter hush of the room. Adrian took one step toward her and held out the packet. "These," he said, his voice lower than the flames, "are the letters my late wife wrote in the weeks before she died. And after what was done in this house last night, I think you deserve to know why someone is so determined to make you fear my protection." Clara did not take the packet at once. She stood a few feet from Adrian Ashford with the fire breathing low behind him and the winter light resting in pale bars across the library carpet. And for one suspended moment the room seemed built entirely of silence, paper, and restraint. The letters in his hand were not merely documents. They were grief made tangible, folded and sealed, and kept through years no one had been allowed to touch. That he now held them out to her felt less like explanation than trust offered in its most difficult form. "Your Grace," she said softly, "you do not owe me this." Adrian's mouth changed by the slightest degree, not into a smile, but into something touched by weariness too deep for concealment. "No," he said, "but I owe the truth more than I owe silence." Clara stepped closer then and accepted the packet with both hands. The ribbon around it was dark blue, faded at the edges from time. The paper beneath her fingers was fine and thick. She looked down at it, then back up at him. "Why? Would someone wish me to fear your protection?" Adrian turned from her and moved a short distance toward the fire, though not in retreat. Rather as a man does when the next words are easier spoken beside flame than under another person's direct gaze. "Because Eleanor did not die for lack of protection," he said at last. "She died because she discovered something in this house that someone believed should remain hidden." Clara felt the air leave her lungs slowly, almost soundlessly. The library seemed to draw closer around them, every shelf and shadow listening. Adrian rested one hand on the mantel, his head slightly bowed, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked not merely burdened by the past, but still bound to it. "The accident everyone accepted," he continued, "was convenient. A horse thrown on an icy road. A carriage wheel caught wrong on the ridge. It was winter, and winter forgives many lies." He lifted his eyes to hers then, and the quiet force in them made the rest of the room disappear. "But Eleanor had begun to suspect that money was being moved through my estate accounts without my knowledge. Not enough to ruin a man of my position. Enough to enrich another one. She wrote those letters because she feared her concerns would be dismissed as anxiety if she spoke them aloud. She meant to place them in my hand herself." Clara tightened her hold on the packet. "And she never had the chance." "No." The word fell between them with the weight of years. She looked down at the ribbon again, imagining another woman in another winter, equally alone in her knowing, equally uncertain whom to trust. Suddenly the cruel messages left for Clara changed shape in her mind. They had not been written merely to frighten her. They had been written to revive an old silence, to turn a dead woman into a warning and a living one into an easy target. "Then whoever wrote those notes," Clara said slowly, "knows what Eleanor suspected, or fears someone else may learn it now." Adrian's gaze sharpened, and for a brief moment there was something like fierce approval in it. Yes. It was such a small word, yet it warmed her more than praise would have done. He took one measured step nearer. "Nathaniel Pembroke did not come here this morning, solely because of you. He came because men like him sense weakness where they hope to find it. He expected scandal, confusion, hesitation. Instead he found my house alert and my patience gone." Clara lifted her eyes fully to his. "Do you believe he is involved?" Adrian did not answer too quickly. That, she had learned, was one of the reasons his words carried such force. He did not waste certainty where certainty had not yet been earned. "I believe opportunists gather around secrets the way crows gather over snow," he said. "Pembroke may be a fool, but fools are often useful to cleverer people." Clara fell silent. The fire shifted. Somewhere high in the library, an old beam gave a quiet creak. She could feel the enormity of what now stood between them, not as distance, but as shared knowledge. The dead Duchess. The forged calm of society. The notes. The open window. The man at the gate claiming rights he did not possess. And beneath it all, the strange and steady fact that Adrian had chosen not to hide the darkest wound of his life from her, but to place it in her hands because he believed she deserved the truth. It was more dignity than the world had ever thought to give her. "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. The words were barely above a whisper. "Why tell me any of this?" Adrian looked at her in a way that made her pulse lose its rhythm. There was no haste in him, no easy sentiment, no softness careless enough to wound by being false. Only that grave, terrible honesty of his, stripped now of every polite defense. "Because last night someone tried to use my past to make you doubt your own safety," he said. "And because I have seen what silence does to a frightened person. It teaches them to mistrust the very hand that means to shield them." Clara could not look away. Something deep within her, some quiet and guarded place that had survived by expecting little and asking for nothing, began to tremble under the weight of being seen so clearly. Adrian reached out then, not to take the letters back, not to command, only to lift one loose page at the top of the packet and turn it enough for her to see Eleanor's hand, elegant and slanted across the paper. His fingers brushed the edge of hers in the smallest accidental contact. Yet the touch moved through Clara like a struck note, brief and pure and impossible to ignore. Adrian felt it too. She knew he did because his hand stilled for the briefest instant before he withdrew. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You should read them here, where no one will disturb you." Clara nodded, though she was no longer certain her breath would obey her properly. Adrian stepped back, but not far. He was giving her space, not distance. There was a difference, and she knew it now. She moved to the chair nearest the fire and sat with the packet in her lap, the ribbon still tied. Outside, winter held the grounds in white silence. Inside, the library seemed warmer than any room in the house had a right to be. Clara slipped the ribbon free and lifted the first letter with careful hands. Before she could unfold it, however, a hard knock struck the library door. Not hurried, not apologetic, deliberate. Adrian turned at once, all gentleness of honesty vanishing beneath alert command. "Who is it?" he asked. There was a pause, and then the butler's voice came through the wood, tightly controlled and unlike itself. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive the interruption. The east room has been searched, the gate riders are gone, and one of the stable boys has found a second packet of letters hidden beneath the late Duchess's carriage seat." The room went still. Clara looked from the letter in her hand to Adrian's face, and in that instant both of them understood the same thing. Eleanor Ashford had not died before the truth could be spoken. She had died while trying to leave it behind.